Hello, I'm Maria Hall Brown, and this is LA Currents. On January 31st, the LA Police Commission unanimously voted to reappoint Chief Michel Moore to his second term, and I'm delighted to welcome him into the studio today to talk all about everything. So good to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so you've been appointed to a second term, but I actually have to say your first term doesn't end for a while.
That's true. The first term ends on the 26th of June, and there'll be a re-swearing in, if you will, for that second and final term.
Okay, well, 5 years goes pretty darn quick. Last time we had an opportunity to chat, I was in your office, and before you came in, I was looking all around the office, and you have so many motivational quotes and so many positive quotes. Okay, so now you've had this, this almost 5-year term, and you're moving into another second term. Do you still have that enthusiasm, that positive motivation, that inspired thought process going forward?
Oh yes, I think so. I believe that I'm a believer. I'm a person of faith. I'm a person and believe that we're here all for a reason, and that building hope, and leaders are purveyors of hope. And when I lose that, it's time for me to go.
Yeah.
So every day. It's not to say that chiefs don't have bad days like all the rest of us. We put our pants on like everyone else, one leg at a time. But no, I'm encouraged, and as we exit the pandemic, I'm particularly encouraged because we're beginning to see our society go back to some of its norms and some of the rituals, some of the things that keep us together as a species. We're a herd group, meaning that we don't work well by ourselves.
Right.
And as we're coming out of this pandemic, we're seeing the results of that with lowering of violent crime, fewer shooting victims, less homicides, lives that are being saved. We're seeing re-engagement with our communities, opportunities for us to attend town halls. I have one after this, to meet and shake hands, have some moments to understand and hear from our communities about what their concerns are and how we can help and support in this shared responsibility of public safety, how we can all work together better to build trust. I'm encouraged that the trust in this department has increased. Trust that we're doing the right things, that we can be relied upon. And while we still have areas of which to improve, Mayor Bass is committed to rebuilding this organization, adding more than 500 of our personnel back into the workforce. That's going to allow us to deepen our community policing and be able to expand our community safety partnerships into more neighborhoods, expand the number of senior leads, deepen our work with alternative services, improve our technology. There's a whole host of things we have before us, and that excites me. It gives me an opportunity to look and say, there's more work to be done, and let's get to it.
Along those lines, because with all of the pandemic and a lot of the tragedies that happened after the pandemic with George Floyd, et cetera, the impressions of the police, just on a grand scale, not just here in Los Angeles, but had to be readdressed, and that's one of the things that you're talking about with Mayor Bass. That she also wants to look at ways to readjust, work with you to reestablish what a police force looks like. So do you see a force in the future that looks dramatically different, that is like departments within the department? You talk about community policing, you talk about, different elements of a police force that may not be historically the way it was, but serves the community better because of the roles that it plays within the community at large.
So I don't see a department within a department. I believe that community policing, relationship policing requires those underlying values to permeate the entire organization. Mm-hmm. And that every position within an organization is there to build public trust and confidence that our work matters and it's purposeful, that it's going out to protect the communities and to serve the communities. So I don't see new departments within the department. Okay. What I do see is that the city government and the whole of government changing. And what I hope to see in my tenure going forward is the dramatic expansion of alternative services, the deepening exponentially of mental health workers and clinicians, not just as outreach workers themselves, but as in our co-response model. Today, we need about 32 additional clinicians to work in the Los Angeles Police Department alongside police officers, mental health clinicians, so that our SMART teams, a co-response model that we're a model agency for the United States policing, is available 24/7, so that when we go to one of the most frequent calls that being a person experiencing a mental health crisis, that if there's a person there involving in violence, a person has a weapon and a threat to others, we need to have a police officer there, but we really need also to have a clinician to help us untangle that, continue to be effective in de-escalation, and get that person help and services. At the same time, we're seeing in the last year and a half, 2 years, sprouts of programs such as a Circle program in Hollywood, Venice, now in Central, Hollenbeck, and growing, where there's no police response at all. But they historically have been calls for service for LAPD to respond to in the thousands, the tens of thousands, that are now being handled by outreach workers, by, again, clinicians, and persons who've been potentially formerly incarcerated or experienced homelessness. And those teams are going out, building trusting relationships, de-escalating and resolving minor neighborhood turmoil, and creating a path for people to take advantage of shelter and housing and services much more effectively than when an officer shows up and has a one-on-one engagement that has no prior relationship, no prior efforts of trust or identifying that our real purpose there is to help them. And instead, they're interpreted as a threat. So the expansion of outreach services, the expansion of the availability of those 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to scale for a city of 4 million across every neighborhood. Mental health is not a social economic issue. The turmoils we see are in all of our communities, but the lack of resources, of proper social service resources, of clinicians and mental health workers and other options rather than police or fire, I'm encouraged the last few years that we've seen those established, and now I'm excited to see an administration and leaders and I think a sense in society that we need to do a better job as a society, be less reliant on police, and find the right tool and the right prescription to help us with these societal ills. So that's going to change policing. It's going to change policing because we're going to be less needed and less required. And that's exciting for me because today we go to far too many of these instances that someone else should be at and should actually be the practitioner to help resolve. And that takes us away from trust-building activities of community engagement and also responding to what today we see as a lesser level of crime. But because of the scarcity of resources, we can't get there fast enough, soon enough, or do enough once we do get there. So it is a different department in the future in a sense of scale and some of the activities we deal with. I'm very excited in the next couple of years that we have new technology projects coming on board that's going to modernize the way we take one of our most crucial functions is the investigation of crime, the documentation, and the articulation of that as we pursue justice in support of our victims, but also holding offenders responsible in our criminal justice system.
It's not like TV.
It is not like TV.
No, it's not. So this is an unusual kind of part of our experience today because as any leader, you have to answer to stakeholders. And we have been working pretty closely with the Youth Development Agency. And we want to, and that's a department that wants young Angelenos to learn and also have their say. Therefore, they have kind of put a little group of questions together. And I was wondering if you're okay with answering some of the questions from the Youth Development Department.
Of course.
Okay, good. All right. You institutionalized the Community Safety Partnership model and the focused on community engagement. You've actually just sort of addressed this in what you were just saying, but in a very real way, why is this important to you?
Well, the Community Safety Partnership Initiative is about building communities' capacity to take on more responsibilities for their own welfare, for their own improvement of safety conditions by understanding how city government works, how social programs are supposed to work, and the interplay with the department is really the glue that comes to a community and says, I know that you've distrusted not just the police, but there's a mistrust of government. We have failed you, the police and others, on so many different fronts. And we want to bring with a group of officers who have been specially trained and are committed to staying in your community for the next 5 years. We want to have them come and sit down and hear and listen to your experience, and to understand and to recognize and acknowledge the mistakes of our past, whether it's the police or others, and map a course forward that says what is important to you, and let's work together to improving the conditions of your community and also understanding and improving how policing in your community meets your needs. And when we do something that is counter to that, that we recognize it and find, are there other strategies other than some of our traditional strategies? And what we've seen in the last decade is we did not see the same levels of violence increase in these communities. In fact, we now see reductions in violence that is exceeding the reductions by percentage that we're seeing as a city. We saw less police use of force, we saw fewer arrests, and we saw the trust in the police go up. So all the numbers are going in the right direction, but more importantly, the trust in the police and the community itself has more confidence that they are, in fact, the authors of their destination. And what we want to take from that, what we are taking from that, is what are the approaches that we're using from the police department that apply to other parts of our department? How should we look through the lens of CSP and look and see how are we looking at a broader area of geographic operations? Because we can't put a CSP site across 465
12
square miles.
doesn't sound like enough.
Well, but it's a resource-intensive model.
Right.
But in the hardest hit communities that have been had lasting decades of distrust of the police, of high rates of violence, to see those communities change is worth that added investment. So CSP, as we institutionalize it, is not that we're going to take it and just come from 12 sites to 50 sites to 100 sites. Our resources don't allow that. But the model of what works within that program, how do we bring that to and incorporate it in the DNA of LAPD across the broad spectrum? And by the way, and it wasn't the first means in which this department has ever approached that problem. When we look at human trafficking, for instance, this department has led the country in policing, recognizing that human trafficking is involving modern slaves, for lack of a better analogy, and these are young women and men, sometimes young people, children, that have been many times coerced or forced into the sex trade. And we historically would look at that from, we would arrest those individuals and prosecute those individuals because they're this recurring offender. And instead, years ago, learning from and listening to researchers and others in a study of this, recognized these are victims. These are survivors of turmoil. And how do we rescue them instead of arrest them? So, CSP is our latest model, but we believe, and I believe going forward, that policing moving forward is taking the best from how we look at human trafficking, how we look at encounters with persons experiencing mental illness, how do we look at dysfunctional relationships in communities that have been long impacted by violent crimes, poor social economic conditions, terrible housing, employment, substance abuse. How do we look at this as a health issue rather than just a traditional crime issue, and bring about solutions from a table of a shared responsibility? Not that we're going to lead this, but we're going to share in the responsibilities that collectively we can become a safer city.
So sort of, understanding what leads to the crime that leads to the need for the police versus just reacting to it. So that's interesting. And then moving into when force is required. The other question that is on the table is, as the chair of the department's use of force review board, what are the big takeaways on how you see the use of force in emergency response situations?
So I think that, first of all, it's ensuring that the public has accurate information about how often or rarely we actually resort to any level of force in the number of encounters that we have. We publish each year, and I encourage the public to go to LAPD online, it's an online website, and look up our use of force annual report. We'll be coming out with the latest edition here within the next 2 or 3 weeks, and it'll report on all of this issue from 2022. But there's the last 7 years are still in there, and those reports will show that over the millions and millions of encounters, the vast majority of them, 95, 96, 97%, 98%, don't involve any force at all.
But you never hear about that.
But those are success often is not broadcasted. You don't know the things that you prevent. You can't count those, and you don't see if an arrest or an encounter or even a contact is without any type of conflict. Those just get bundled up as, okay, well, there's nothing to see here. But in reality, those are important because many of those instances had ingredients of conflict, had ingredients and levers that could have been pulled or could have been activated by a wrong approach by the policing. So the vast majority of the time, our officers come into tumultuous, uncertain, and complex situations, and they're able to safely resolve them, they're safely to find alternatives, to create time and distance, and to find ways in which not to have to resort to force. Now, last year, though, 2,200 instances out of the 1,600,000, 1,700,000, 1,800,000 encounters, we had to resort to force. The vast majority of those was using physical force that the person complained of an injury. The person wasn't nothing greater than that. But there was also 31 instances in which we resort to the use of deadly force. And in those instances, that's a reduction from the year before of 37. Our historic low is 26 and 27, which was the first 2 years of my tenure as chief. 26, 27, 31, 37, those are the lowest numbers that we've seen since 1990. That was the last time we counted, or that we have records of the numbers of officer-involved shootings. Those numbers have often exceeded 60, 70, 100, 110. So we've seen improvements, and we've seen improvements both by better policies, stricter accountability, better tools, and extremely much more success in the areas of training. However, we still had, with 31 officer-involved shootings, 31 too many. And our effort is to have that number at 0. So in doing that, in that scheme, our effort is, I believe we made historic strides during a very tumultuous time of further strengthening under the leadership of the Board of Police Commissioners, Commissioner President Briggs, Commissioner President President Decker, and the entire board to strengthen our use of force policies, where we saw duty to intervene, we saw the words like proportionality, we saw things like the efforts of recognizing you could not use a chokehold, that you had to take steps in order to create distance, and that the use of force was a last resort. So policies strengthened. Accountability. We have had officer-involved shootings found out of policy. And so when I say those numbers, it's not like every one of those was an in-policy shooting. In fact, in 2020 and 21, about a third of those shootings were found out of policy, and there was accountability for those failures and for those shortcomings. Now, lastly, the ones that were in policy, we continue to examine, though, to see what techniques could we use or what tactics or tools. And during this course of time, we've expanded our ability to have access to less lethal tools. We've improved upon those tools, so people who come at us with weapons like knives or switchblades or machetes and those type of weapons, we don't have to immediately resort to deadly force. And what we saw was in 2021, where we had 15 of our 37 officer-involved shootings involved an edged weapon, something other than a firearm. That number dropped to 5 last year. So I believe that's a direct result of officers having the ability to deal with persons with those type of weapons and not resort to deadly force. Now, the reality is that you don't know how many weapons involve being knives and weapons other than firearms are in that stat, because that's not a stat that's reported. But we do see the reduction. I want to thank the Los Angeles Police Foundation, who donated more than $1.6 million to establish a virtual reality system at our academy, in our gymnasium, a state-of-the-art one that allows us to work as teams and work with virtual reality suits. They're full suits from your head to your toe. They have sensors, biometric feedback, and it allows us to work as teams, as avatars that then create avatars. And we go into scenarios where we can do a scenario-based training where officers get to see and hear and experience what it means to deal with a person experiencing a mental health crisis, armed with a weapon other than a firearm, having a psychosis event and threatening suicide, and perhaps taking steps where the person is wanting the officer to facilitate that. This is not a virtual reality system where we're playing some game of war or some shoot 'em up. Rather, it's a system that shows the effectiveness of teamwork, of communications, of working through a scenario with patience and dialogue. And also, at the end of that, all of this is recorded, so the officers can debrief their own performance. They can talk amongst each other about how they could have improved it further. And I believe that that's going to establish a whole nother level of muscle memory and cognitive ability, because we ask a lot of people, of our young people, young and old, 25, 26, 27-year-old, they may never have seen a person having a mental health crisis and experiencing something with a weapon other than a firearm or even a firearm. in which now they're confronted in a life and death decision that they have a split second to make. The virtual reality system is going to allow us to put them in those scenarios, keep them safe, but let them see that they can successfully rely upon the tools and training that we give them to see these matters realistically and successfully resolved. And I believe that that will cut down those numbers even further, and we'll see even more success of being a department that can be relied upon to use deadly force, to use any force, only when necessary, and certainly deadly force as a last resort.
You actually just answered my next question, which was technological advancements, but you made me think of something while you were talking, because you have this balance that you need to maintain between recruitment and also making sure that the mental health capacity and capability of your officers is sound, and that you can determine what kind of chinks in the army before you actually put a badge on them. So how is that being addressed now when you are looking to expand and hire, but at the same time hire the right people?
So that's the thing. To your audience, I want to say we're hiring. And we're hiring not just police officers, we're hiring nearly every position in the organization. So civilian professional positions, accounting positions, technical people in our science field, administrative clerks, all sorts, communication operators at our 911 centers. We need to hire hundreds and hundreds of personnel in the aftermath of this pandemic and in the attrition of our workforce. And we also recognize that we're in a very scarce, we have a very scarce labor pool. It's a zero unemployment. And so we're in a very competitive environment. But people need to have and recognize that every city and every department and every public service is not the Los Angeles, not the city of Los Angeles nor the LAPD. And we offer, we think, a front row seat to a global city with tremendous opportunities of not just pride, but also sophistication. What this city does for its people, while there's areas for us to improve, is unmatched, in my belief, across America. And people can be a part of that story. And in this market, that's an uphill battle. But what we're saying is a couple things. One, we're not going to lower our standards to meet those numbers. There are people who I've seen that mistake in the past. I've seen agencies that today are adjusting standards per se so that they can meet their numbers. And we're not going to do that, because every time that has ever happened, 5 to 7 years later, you get an echo effect of an organizational failure that costs you many more than just going without. Mm-hmm. So we're going to only hire those that are qualified, period. Now, we are going to look and ensure that the qualifications are relevant. And what I mean by that is something as simple as cannabis. When I came on the organization, there was gas lamps and Model Ts, but 1981. But the use of
come into the city.
Cannabis, exactly. Cannabis was, I didn't know what cannabis. I knew what marijuana was, but cannabis, the whole terminology of this was different. Fast forward 40 years later, cannabis today is adult for adult use is a legal drug. Mm-hmm. It's a legal intoxicant. And so standards of yesterday in regards to the absolute prohibition of using cannabis, and it really, as recently as 5 to 10 years ago, if you admitted to using cannabis, you would not be hired. Today, that's different. So people need to know that our standards today are relevant to what our societal standards are. But they also must know that the use, for instance, of cannabis, like alcohol, if there's evidence of abuse, of misuse, then that is not a person that's suitable for this job, for the privilege of wearing this badge. But we make those adjustments because we want to live within the norms of society. We also recognize that, for instance, on the financial side, we've gone through a terrible period with the pandemic, and people may have fallen back on a payment or on rent or some other obligation. And so they come in with a checkered credit history. Well, that's not an automatic disqualifier. We're adjusting and looking at the whole person and recognizing their life circumstances. And as long as they can act and demonstrate a responsibility to their financial obligations and understand the means of living within their means, we want to invest in that person who wants to invest in this profession and be a part of this department. So background standards are relevant to today. They are still stringent. We look to the emotional intelligence, the integrity, to not be about them, but be a life of service. We don't want people that think that this is just a green beret. There's times for our military, there's times for warriors, and there's certainly our armed forces as they defend our nation from the enemies. But policing is not about enemies. Policing is about service, and protecting people from those that would prey upon others. We're an agency that if you want to work in policing, if you want to work in an exciting environment, in a world-class city, come to LA. We'll hire you in a timely fashion. We'll get you into an academy. 6 months later, you'll be working the streets of Los Angeles, and you will have started a career that, 30 to 40 years later, you'll be able to look back and say, that was a good decision.
You've had that career. You have another term ahead of you. You've said that you want to maybe abbreviate that slightly in order to have a smooth transition before a large event.
The Olympics.
Very clearly. Thought process behind that?
I think it's a responsible thing to do. The reality is that by charter, my second and it will be my final term, so I tap out. I can do no more than 2 5-year terms. That would end in June of 2028. The Summer Games and Paralympics for the Los Angeles for the third time, and I was here in 1984 as a police officer, will be in July of 2028. And having both experienced it as a police officer nearly 40 years ago, and knowing today, that's going to be an enormous event. We've already started the planning for it. The complexities of that event in concert with the World Cup in 2026 sets a scenario and a stage that policing and public safety will be at a hyper level in 2028. That is not a time to be changing chiefs. That's not a time to be moving from one administration to the other. And so my succession planning, and every chief should have one, should be clear to those on the inside and outside about the timing of departure. I'm not going to give the day or the month, but I think it was appropriate to not suggest that I would stay to the very last moment and then put the city in a tumultuous situation of who would follow me. Someone will follow me. It'll be sometime in my second term. I've talked about 2 or 3 years, but it wants to be that how can I be effective, as long as I am effective, both internally, with our elected officials, with our community, and a sense of myself, a satisfaction, and also the support of my family. And I must say that as much as I mentioned that last, Cindy and my daughter were the first in that contemplation of whether or not I would continue this effort. I owe them the world for their investment or allowing me to have entered in this role in the last 4.5 years, and they've remained supportive of me, and through that love and support has allowed me to do the job. And so when it came to this juncture, the first question was to them, and I was grateful for their support, but there also was a statement about yes, but how long? And so we'll take that going forward. But rest assured, I'm looking forward to, as we begin this second term, spend enough time that gets us ready for these world events and provides for an orderly transition for someone who will continue the great work of being a chief of what I think is the greatest department in the world.
And then you can sit and relax and enjoy the games.
There you go.
There you go. Chief Moore, thank you so much for this. And if people want to learn about the opportunities for employment with the LAPD or what's going on with the LAPD, what's the best way?
Well, first of all, they can volunteer. Come down to any of our 21 police stations. We have some 2,000 plus volunteers. We would love to have them join us as a community of volunteers. There's a host of volunteer efforts that they can do. They can get behind the curtain. It's kind of like visiting your studios here. What people see on the screen, I can only try to describe to them what really makes up this production. It's outstanding people is what makes it up, and equipment and technology. But they can be a volunteer with us, and we have ample opportunities. Secondly, if they want to be a little more distant than that, they can come to town halls and join us in neighborhood watch meetings and coffee with the cops. And then lastly, if they just want to go to the online site, they can go to LAPD Online. And they can look there and they can see a host of thousands of pages and videos and vignettes and other information about all aspects of our operations. But whatever they do, I would ask that they be involved. The city of Los Angeles is a safer city when all Angelinos are working together for just that goal.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's a wrap on this LA Currents.